Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Welcome to today's webinar from Vuelio, Mapping the Media, How Do Stories Travel Today's Fragmented Media Landscape? Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, some housekeeping. We encourage you to submit any questions you might have for today's panelists in the Q&A section down below, which we'll answer at the end of the session. Any questions we don't have time for today, we'll answer in a follow-up post on the Vuelio website. And a recording of today's webinar will be emailed out to everybody who signed up over the next few days, and a write-up will also be going out on the blog. And firstly, let's introduce today's panelists. Just go to the next slide. And firstly, I'm your host, PJ Boyd, and I work across the Vuelio and Responsibles brands on the Pulsar Group content team, covering the UK creative industries, which obviously includes PR and comms, public affairs, politics, and the media. I have a background in research, and I also worked as a freelance journalist across national press, trade and consumer magazines, but also lots of online outlets. And I was writing about a mix of politics, pop culture and marketing. And if I can pass to Sean, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, PJ. Nice to be here. My name's Sean. I am Burson's Head of Media Relations Strategy, as it helpfully says on the screen, so I can remember my own job title. I have worked at this agency under its various names for nearly 4 years now, leading our engagement and innovation within the earned media space across all of our different practices, from corporate to consumer, health to technology. Before that, I worked in the PR and comms industry for just over 9 years. And previous to that, I was a broadcast journalist for over a decade, predominantly for Sky and the BBC.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. And Jacob, if we could pass to you.
Yeah, hello. Nice to be here as well. My name is Jacob. I work for a company called JournalismUK, formerly known as journalism.co.uk. That's a trade specialist publication reporting on the digital news industry. So we report on media trends, and our audience very much are journalists, editors, media professionals. I work there as the community editor. I file stories, and I also really touch base with our audience, make sure we understand the sort of things that they're coming up against at work and making sure that we're responding to those in our coverage and our events.
Great, thank you, Jacob. And if we go to the next slide, let's dig in. So if you've been in the PR and comms industry since before the emergence of digital, you'll remember the huge importance of securing headlines in print, in national press and on broadcast. And while those channels are still incredibly important, of course, the landscape has completely changed. There are plenty of other opportunities to connect with audiences, but with the opportunities come greater challenges. So the data backs this up. According to this year's Reuters Institute Digital News Report, traditional media news consumption is down, which is a clear sign that the broader ecosystem is fragmenting. UK audiences have shifted away from print, unsurprisingly, but also television, which is down to 12% and 48% respectively. Audiences are instead moving towards online first and mobile-led media, including newer platforms like TikTok, which are offering news and entertainment in vertical video formats, which are ideal for the shorter attention spans many of us have now, and also for more niche interests. And they're also just much more digestible. So the traditional top-down approach of securing coverage for PR teams, putting out your messaging via a press release and waiting for write-ups and reaction, it just doesn't work for all of these platforms. But that's not to say that traditional media isn't important. A front page splash on a national press title is always going to be incredibly valuable. But big name established media brands have branched out into new formats to find audiences where they are now. And of course, PR people need to do this too. So Sean, if I could ask you, could you tell us a bit about the changes that you've noticed throughout your time in the media and PR from, say, when you started in the industry to where you are now?
Well, I don't think that, the first paragraph, I don't think will come as any surprise to anyone. If you got on the tube this morning, I doubt you saw many people reading broadsheet newspapers, whereas everybody would have been staring at their screens and scrolling. I think what is helpful and what makes it less depressing and a bit more positive is if you don't think about news, and you just think about information. And yes, people aren't consuming traditional media in the same way, but they are still consuming information and content. And that's essentially what media provides. That's essentially what news organizations provide. PJ, you mentioned about people's attention spans. The average length that people can pay attention to one screen is 43 seconds. So that's what we've got to work with now. And yes, we might not be seeking out TV news on a linear TV channel, but 60% of people watch their TV news coverage on Instagram and TikTok. So they are still going to the BBC, to Sky, to CNN, to Reuters, to other organizations to find that TV news content. They're just finding it in other places. They're finding it via social media. So I think the key for us is now no longer to think of the newspaper being the number one target for this. Actually, think about where your audience is. If they're listening to, rather than aiming for the front page of the Times, which would always be lovely, are they listening to a Times podcast? Are they listening to Times Radio? Are they reading one of the specialist subscriber-led Times newsletters? If that's where the audience is, that's where we need to go. So I think the public are still engaged with news. However, they're just engaged with it in different ways. So it's up to us as comms people to go to where our audiences are, rather than where we think they are, or rather than where they were traditionally.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Sean. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Times, because we'll be talking about the Times a bit more in a couple of slides' time. So let's look at a little bit more data first as well. So if we go to the next slide. So yeah, lots of nice data here for us to look at. I won't read through all of it, I'll just do a summary. But yeah, in the place of papers and TV, there are many media platforms for comms teams to consider now for sharing their message and stories. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's easier to reach an audience in this fragmented media landscape. So we've got some more data from Reuters here. So according to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, interest in news has almost halved in the UK over the last decade, from 70% in 2015 to just 38% last year. And it's interesting to look into who are most likely to avoid the news. And according to the data, it's women, young people, and those without a university degree. But news avoidance is a trend across many audience groups. But that's something that the media are doing a lot to bring people back into the news and to content. But could you say that this decline is tied to the decline of print? Not necessarily. So less than half of those asked about news consumption for an opinion poll earlier this year said that they watch news programs regularly on television. And for radio, the number fell to 29% and down to 28% for news websites. But that's not all doom and gloom. One bright spot is that rise of vertical assets, vertical video. And that's something that many news organizations and publishers are investing in as a way to engage the disengaged and bring them back into the fold, as Sean was talking about there. So if we just go to the next slide, and now is when we come to the Times example. So this is an example of media brands branching out into these new platforms to connect with audiences where they are now. And the Times have been really, really successful with this. So speaking at this year's Future of Media Technology conference, the Times and Sunday Times Deputy Head of Digital, Anna Sabatoni, spoke about the success of the brand's app for retaining audiences and building a community and bringing people back into consuming their content. So this is a brand that's around 240-ish years old. It's very, very established, very, very trusted. And it's managed to bring audiences back into consuming news and content by centering community and by encouraging interaction in the comment section once people are in the app and making sure that readers feel heard. It's not just a one-way street of broadcasting information. Readers can interact with the content. So Jacob, as the community editor for Journalism UK, what's your take on this new centering of community and building audience retention in the media industry? Is that something that you've noticed a greater focus on?
Yes, absolutely. I think the reason for this is fairly obvious, which is that direct traffic is not really what it once was. I think the territories of search and social are fiercely competitive, and news is increasingly losing the fight there. And so what that means is that closed spaces like apps and LinkedIn groups or whatever, these closed networks become all the more important to keeping readers with you, and a space where they can find you and build those loyal, everyday, regular habits. And this is one of many examples of news organizations that are following this trend at the moment.
Thank you, Jacob. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll have a look at how much further the media is fragmented as well. Online forums have become just as important as media brands' own extensions. So as an example here, OpenWeb's Director of Publisher Development, Tom Rolfe, spoke at this year's Future of Media Technology conference as well, highlighting the need to shift from top of funnel traffic, so that's traffic from Google search, which of course has been heavily impacted by the rise of LLMs. And a lot was made of that as well at this conference as well, and how terrifying and exciting that is. But this move from the top of funnel traffic to mid funnel engagement instead. So for example, the rise of Reddit comes into this, community features, reaction tools, and commenting as well. So when planning the sharing of a story with the media, social platforms and forums have to be taken into consideration now as part of that. They can prolong a story, they can kill it completely, and they can even warp it beyond all recognition from when you originally shared it. Audience engagements make outreach a two-way street now. And if we go to the next slide. So this is, we're going to go through some examples of what can happen to a story in this fragmented multi-platform landscape, with its like myriad of audiences of news avoiders, content creators, angry commenters, and also, of course, there's bad actors out there with their own agendas to take into consideration. But then there are also lots of people who genuinely want to read and enjoy your content and share it. So again, it's not all doom and gloom. And we're going to be looking at some trends that came up as part of our recent white paper, which was How News Travels in Today's Fragmented Media Environment, which you can find on the Vuelio website. So for this white paper, we tracked 5 big public interest stories from the first half of this year, first half of 2025, just to highlight how narratives can travel through the huge media ecosystem that we have now, that we're operating in. And each of these stories took very different journeys. Some sparked the interest of the national press after a flurry of conversation on social platforms. And then others, they moved from mainstream media coverage from, say, a press release, and then moving to detailed discussion on more niche forums like Reddit, for example. But of course, other forums are available with highly engaged audiences. And we'll go through a few of those trends now that it's worth taking note of that might be helpful with planning your media strategy going forward. So if we go to the next slide. So nicheification, going niche. Despite the huge variety of platforms that are out there now, there's still, obviously, as we mentioned before, still significant pressure on comms teams to get that big front page splash. And that can be obviously from clients on the agency side, or it can be from your C-suite if you're part of an in-house team at a big brand. But a story doesn't have to hit the front page of a national newspaper to reach the right audience, as we've been talking about. So analysing a specific story's journey can highlight the different routes that are now available to find audiences. And this is just one of the stories that we tracked for the white paper, AI for Heart Health. So we tracked coverage and conversation around this topic. And this really, really highlights the importance of not centering just tabloid coverage or broadsheet coverage. It shouldn't be the ultimate aim for every campaign. It won't work for every campaign that you'll be working on. So this particular story's spread was rooted in science-led articles in academic journals, and as well as organic community-driven conversation on forums. And then it moved into the mainstream online news outlets. You can see here from this chart, AI for Heart Health at the top had huge coverage in online news. But before it got that, it was being talked about like as a topic in academic journals, being talked about on social media, and then it went into online news. That's how online news picked it up. And one of the specific stories that got huge coverage in online news titles, which included national press, was a story about pajamas that could track heart health using AI. So that was an interesting and odd story, which got a lot of coverage, but it did actually start in academic journals and people talking about it on Reddit. So it reached a mainstream audience, but it also reached that really specific and highly valuable stakeholder audience that are interested in academia, that are interested in science and interested in health. And that's a really important point to consider, that volume alone doesn't tell the whole story. Reaching a small but highly engaged audience of experts and academics and policymakers as well can be more valuable than a fleeting mention on a national broadcast, which people won't necessarily be engaged with if it's not a topic that they're interested in. But this also applies to formats as well. While radio coverage volume, it might dwarf that of podcasts, as you can see on this chart here. Podcasts we've got in pink there, and you can only see very, very small slivers for all of these stories. That could actually still be incredibly valuable, because podcasts have a dedicated audience of people who have chosen to download them and therefore are much more likely to be engaged with what they're listening to. So landing a mention on a podcast could be a much more strategic win for a comms team than a dozen scattered radio clips that listeners might be likely to zone out of. And then if we go on to the next slide, now we're going to be talking about politics. And just off the back of the budget announcement, we have to consider the impact of this on our comms. So political and regulatory attention, like, for example, a CMA, a Competition and Markets Authority investigation, can prolong a narrative's life cycle significantly, and it can land stories in completely unexpected sectors that you might not have planned for when you were putting your campaign strategy together. So here's another example. It's reporting around the RAAC crisis, for example. It was another one of our track stories for this report. Surprisingly, it received more coverage in regional outlets when we tracked it than in the construction and property sector outlets. And another surprise was the story of surge pricing that we tracked, which received surprisingly little coverage in law-focused outlets, despite questions from online audiences about its legality, and also questions from politicians as well and people in Parliament around its legality. So every comms campaign which intersects in any way with the political or public sphere, and if we're honest, that's going to be most of them, it will already be subject to regulation, but it's important not to forget political commentary and the strong public feeling that will naturally come along with this as well. So it's worth considering what to do when a story does become politicised in this way, and many of them will. So what we would advise from looking at the data, from looking into this for our report, it would be correct misinformation at pace and offer good data where you can, offer that to the press, to engage directly with the media and political influencers involved, to not go quiet, and then also to motivate third-party stakeholder voices to add credibility and balance to your position on the story. And Vuelio's own Kelly Scott, our political whiz, she's highlighted as part of this report that once a story is out of your hands and it starts pinballing around all these different media fragments and being commented on by all these different political stakeholders, action has to be taken really, really quickly by a comms team because it can go out of hand. And then if we go to the next slide, we've got another trend here as well to take note of, which is the two-track story. And this was quite a strange and unexpected one when looking at media fragmentation. And this is how a single story or topic, it can spread in distinct ways that never end up intersecting, even though a lot of these media platforms do intersect themselves. So despite all of these interconnected platforms that make up our media ecosystem now, stories can still become severely siloed and in their own echo chambers. And if you think about it, sometimes that can harm a story and that can stop it from traveling where you want it to. But then sometimes it can benefit it. For example, if it's a story, if it's a crisis, if it's something that you actually don't want to go further, you might want to silo it into one particular community or one particular ecosystem, one particular echo chamber. So monitoring niche publications and social spaces to understand which stories have the capacity to break through into the mainstream is really important. And that's if you want a mainstream general audience to see it and interact with it. And of course, if you don't as well. if it's something that you don't want everybody to know about. So comms teams, if they want to, they can bridge silos by identifying connectors within the audience and within the media landscape. So one example of this was in surge pricing coverage, and there was a lot of that this year. And it actually split the audience into two when we analysed it. So broadsheets took one route with it, and tabloids took a completely different route with their reporting, even when they were writing about the same issue. Broadsheets, they covered the story through the lens of regulation and fairness, but tabloids mainly went down the route of talking about the specifics of ticket prices for gigs and also the price of pints and alcohol. And there were lots of mentions, of course, of Oasis tickets as well and how difficult they were to get hold of. I can't relate. I'm more of a Blur fan, but anyway. And so connectors for the story of surge pricing, they were national broadcasters, which provided a shared space for people. Also, specific interest publications, and examples of those were Lad Bible and Sky Sports, which reach audiences across class lines that have shared interests. And for that example, it was sport. And then also there were influencers and experts that acted as connectors that can project a story across very different groups. And one example of that is Martin Lewis in the finance sector. Of course, he's a huge name, he's a household name, but also it's important to consider micro influencers as well, which have their own communities that follow them. So macro influencers and micro influencers. And these connectors, they're a vital part of modern media relations strategy, and they provide lots of opportunities to break a story out of a single self-reinforcing narrative or echo chamber. That's if you want to break your story out of that, of course. And then if we go to slide 11, I will now pass on to Sean, who can share some of his insight from the front lines of PR.
Thank you, PJ. The first on the next slide, I am sorry to lower the tone, but I'm going to quote Elon Musk after Donald Trump's last victory in the presidential election, where he said, "You are the media now," and that it was succinct in a way, but it did sum up the way that I think the comms landscape and the media landscape has gone. Everyone is the media now, but I prefer to talk about everyone being a publisher. And I think that includes brands as well. So an example here is the Dish podcast from Waitrose. As a brand, they are publishing content, and they are competing with media organizations, with influencers, with individuals, all for attention. And we all exist on social now. And lots of, I have colleagues at other agencies who talk about social first. From our perspective, it's social everywhere and social always. Yes, we are consuming video from the BBC, but we tend to be consuming it on social media. So the biggest shift, I think, is this shift to us all being publishers. Everyone has the opportunity to create content and distribute it. And on the next slide, I think it relates to that as well. At the heart of this sort of next wave of comms that we're in is a democratization of who can be a journalist, who can tell a story, who can be a publisher. Previously, it was just people like Jacob and me who had NCTJ qualifications that we spent all of our parents' money on, that they're still bitter about, who could call themselves journalists. Now, anyone can be a journalist, anyone can be a reporter. There are news influencers, there are reporter influencers. They didn't exist a year or two ago. So there is a complete decentralization of who spreads information and who is influencing opinion. And finally, on the next slide, I think that relates into how we now plan and how we plan our campaigns, how we plan our outreach. We no longer look at, okay, what channels do we need to look at? How do we target print journalists? How do we look at social? What we now try to do, and PJ's used this phrase a few times, is look at the ecosystem. And the first thing we like to do is look at the voices. Who are the voices that are influencing our target consumer and our target audience? Is it brands? Is it particular journalists? Is it influencers? Is it Gemini and ChatGPT? So firstly, looking at those voices, then looking at those channels. Are they consuming them via broadcast? Are they consuming them on their mobile phone? Are they consuming them in real life? And the third thing to do is look at the platforms they're on and then create the content that reaches them on those platforms. Are they consuming content on Instagram, on TikTok, on other social media platforms? Are they watching the content on YouTube? Is it an audio, are they mostly steering towards audio on Spotify? And I think at the heart of this is, as I said before, sort of getting rid of the way we have traditionally done things and breaking down those silos between the different channels. Where are our audiences consuming their content, and how do we reach them? What is their ecosystem? And looking, as you said, PJ, look at those connectors between different formats and different channels as well.
Okay, thank you, Sean. And then if we move to the next slide, yes. So now we're going to come to the media point of view with Jacob Granger from JournalismUK. So if we drop the slides, and then we can have a chat with Jacob. So I've got some questions. So if we start with, how has the media pivoted to these new approaches to counter the rise of news avoidance?
Well, I'm going to tackle that on a broader level for a second, PJ, because I think news avoidance is a symptom of a larger problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you talked earlier on about attention right now. And I would go as far as to say right now, the news industry is facing an attention crisis. Probably there's three aspects of this. News avoidance is one of them, and it's all compounded by one extra factor. So news avoidance being the first one we can look at, I think, you talked about the digital news report by the Reuters Institute. It's 46% of people here in the UK say they sometimes or often avoid the news. And there's lots of different reasons for that. But I think it is just a symptom of mostly the news being really depressing and there just being so much of it. Complete information overload. A second symptom of this problem is distrust towards the news. I mean, this is been a more long-standing problem, but it is now becoming a deeper problem with the arrival of Gen AI and this layer and this lens coming in of saying, is what I'm looking at legitimate? Is it actually created by a journalist? And then the third part of this is to do with increased competition from, as Sean points out, the rise of influencers, content creators, and this hybrid of sort of content journalists as well. So us in the media sort of being muscled out by new players as well. And so the resulting force of all of this is that it is just harder and harder to get people's attention nowadays. And the only solution to that problem, as far as I'm concerned, is a greater emphasis on relevance and really understanding exactly what it is that people care about and making sure that is your focal point and making sure you're addressing that every day in your coverage. I'd say for the last 10 years or so, the news industry has been grappling with this problem and at least thinking about how do we create more audience-centric strategies and being more relevant to our users. The most sort of groundbreaking framework of this is called the user needs model. That was brought in by Dimitri Shishkin then at the BBC World Service. But I would say it's really gathered steam in the last 5 years, where this is being adopted and tweaked and innovated on by different news outlets. And what it essentially means is that we don't need to do as much content. We can do less as long as it's more relevant. And it might not be the latest update, and it might not be what's breaking. It might be that people want they want some light-hearted content. They want to be distracted in some way. They want, to follow up on a story 12 months down the line. There's more to this, the publishing model of today, than just what's breaking and what's just happened, the who, what, where, when, why that Sean and I were trained on as journalists. The only answer to news avoidance and these other problems I've outlined is a greater emphasis on relevance and understanding who your readers are, what they care about, what their pain points are, and making sure those are addressed.
Okay, fantastic. And talking about understanding what your audience needs, talking about it from the PR perspective as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the approach that PR should take when they're trying to secure coverage and working with the media, and maybe, being a bit more flexible with approaches dealing with the media?
Well, you answered your own question there, PJ. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think, as I've just outlined, news organizations have a hard enough problem on their hands getting people not just to look at news content because of how fragmented the space is, but also care about it and use it on some level. And then off the back of that, hopefully pay for it. You know, the numbers on this are really low in the UK. I think it's about 13% of people pay for the news. So in terms of the approach for the PR, it has to be respecting the fact that newsrooms know their readers best, and you need to trust them to do their jobs, trust them to know the right angles, to know the right treatments for the stories. If they're saying this is a story for social, that's probably going to look quite different on the other side than if they were to run it on the front page of their newspaper. There might be completely different set of values and treatments and, you know, approaches to telling that story. But it might also be that they come back and say, look, there's an entirely different angle here that we should explore, and you should be open to that, because, you know, it is in newsrooms, news organizations' interest to perfect this, because if they don't, news organizations now will live or die by how relevant they are to their audience. So they're not doing it to be a pain in the ass. They're doing it because they know best, and it's their survival on the line, essentially.
Okay, and talking about media fragmentation and the future of all this, do you have any predictions for which platforms you think will become more popular for publishers to use for engaging with their audiences? Are there any particular platforms that you think will fall off in popularity?
Do you mean social media platforms?
Could be, yeah. Or
Could
yeah.
be. Because we need to distinguish, because
Yeah.
we could talk about social media platforms, or you could talk about the arrival of newsletter platforms, podcasting platforms, etc.
Mm-hmm.
If we talk about social media platforms, which I think is probably the easier one for me to navigate,
Yeah.
I think TikTok's going to be here for some time, to be honest with you. How it looks for news is going to continue to evolve. I am surprised right now about how useful LinkedIn is for news, and I think that is gathering steam, but I think it could hit a saturation point. And I don't know, it's just if you look at the platforms in growth for news use, it is the video-led platforms of YouTube in particular. I think YouTube is the fastest growing platform for news at the moment. So that has come a really long way in recent years, particularly with the arrival of Shorts and Instagram as well. You know, those legacy platforms of Facebook and X are just going to become less and less useful for news with the way that they're being managed from the top.
Okay, thank you. And I'm aware that the audience will have questions as well. So we'll move on.
I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, we're ready to go. So we'll dig into a few more slides first, and then we'll get to that. And also, it'd be great to get Sean's take as well on the rise of vertical media. But yeah, we'll go through some other bits first. And yeah, so please do submit your questions in Q&A, and we'll get to those hopefully in a few minutes. So yeah, let's look a little bit more about fragmentation and pluralism. So this is a quote that was shared at the recent Journalism AI Festival by Irene J. Liu, and talking about all the opportunity that comes with all of these challenges, as well. The opportunity for new voices and new perspectives to break through in the media and to break through to greater audiences as well, and to speak to audiences that maybe traditionally haven't been catered to by the big publishers. Now, if we go on to the next slide as well, and this is a quote from our friend Charlie Beckett at LSE as well, talking about social media is, of course, the biggest thing to happen to the media for a century. And now maybe that will be overtaken by AI as well, and LLMs, and that impact on audiences and the media and comms as well, and how we work day to day. So social media did bring greater access, of course, to audiences with content, and also for PR teams with audiences. And while that can seem overwhelming, and as well, like looking at all of the trends that we've been looking at today, the media and comms industries have always been good at adapting to the changing world around them. That's part of the job of a journalist, and also that's the part of the job of a comms team, of course. And hopefully we can all handle it. I think we can. And then if we move to the next slide, here are some quick extra bits to consider when you're planning your strategy for outreach in this environment. So think ecosystem, not endpoint. This would mean to stop treating media coverage as the finish line, instead build responsive strategies that can anticipate how stories will evolve across all of these different platforms. And then point 2, reframe monitoring as navigation. Tracking coverage isn't just about counting clips anymore, it's about understanding how narratives are reframed to know exactly when to step in, clarify, or to amplify. And then the last point as well is embed adaptability into your campaigns. Build in that flexibility. And this would mean having spokespeople and expert commentators ready to engage quickly to retain a degree of control in very unpredictable times. And then if we go to our next slide, we have come to our Q&A. So thank you to everyone who has submitted questions so far. Please do add anything else that you would like to ask our panelists, as we've still got a few minutes left together until 2:45 when we finish. So any we don't have time for today will be answered in a follow-up blog on the Vuelio website. So let's get to these questions. So let's see. Here we go. And I think this is probably an interesting one for both of you, actually. But if I go to Shaun first, what would be your advice on how to decide when to step into silos or misunderstandings to bring them back to the target narrative? And that could be either via company spokespeople or third parties.
Interesting. I mean, I would advise that you basically estimate the potential damage. If a erroneous narrative has gone out there, how far has it traveled? How much damage is it doing? It would be at this point, I would look at using data and some of our tools to see how far you think this is going, and if it is worth stepping in. If it's one rogue article or a few rogue posts that haven't been picked up elsewhere, it may you may be drawing attention to it by getting involved. So I think it's about looking at the data in terms of how far these stories and narratives or content has traveled before you make that decision. I don't know what Jacob thinks.
Kind of outside of my remit, so I don't have a view on it really.
No, fair enough. And I think this might be an interesting one for you, Jacob, actually. What would be your opinion on WhatsApp as a way to reach audiences?
Well, hold on. Give me a second. I can answer that. Let's see.
And I'll come to you on this one as well, Shaun, in a moment.
So I've just pulled up the digital news report that we talked about earlier on. It says that in the UK, 70% of people use WhatsApp, 10% use it for news. So I think that tells you what you need to know. Like, it's probably not going to be people's pace to find news. If anything, people associate it for like friends and family and that sort of thing. So it's kind of an uncomfortable place to really receive news updates. Generally speaking, you're probably not going to have huge buy-in, and there's not a huge appetite for that at this point in time.
Okay, interesting. And Shaun, what would be your take on the use of WhatsApp?
I'd mostly agree. I think obviously not for scale, clear, just judging by those stats there, not for scale, but for particularly engaged communities, if they're subscribed to specialist channels and groups, it is a way. But as always, follow the data, find out where your consumers are. If they are swayed by voices and channels and groups on WhatsApp, then go to them to get your message out.
Yeah, Shaun makes a good point there. Really, it could be a really good idea for certain loyal, maybe specialist audience groups for building loyalty and habits, which are really key metrics for today. It also depends on your demographic as well that you're looking at. WhatsApp usage might be more popular in certain parts of the world. Equally, you've got platforms like Telegram, which are really popular in like Asia or something like that, parts of Africa. So it really depends on your demographic. But here in the UK, it's fairly limited.
Okay, thank you. And I think this is one probably for Shaun. How do you know or find out for sure where your audiences are compared to where you think they are, or to get confirmation that they are where you think they are?
I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I think it's an interesting question. My colleague Alison Spray, who here is our Chief Data Intelligence Officer for EMEA, always talks about moving from thinking to knowing. And that has to be the goal really in anything we do and things and what we do for our clients. And I think earned media traditionally has more jeopardy than other channels. You can pay an influencer to put a message out, and exactly, generally how many people it's going to reach and what the demographics of those people are, and you can find that on a platform like Creator IQ. However, earned media tends to be more influential, but it involves more risk. The answer, sadly, is for all of us is data. There are, that's where you need to find out where your audiences are. We can't guess. Now, if you are working on a specific brand or a specific client, I would assume you have quite a lot of knowledge around that. And I would advise you to get to know your consumers and get to know them as much as you can. If you're working in football, you know that they're going to be looking at football-based content. They're going to be reading the sports pages, but they're also going to be looking on Sky Sports online. They're going to be following the Joe Football and Joe Sport social channels. So I think it's a mixture of intuition, but also, as always, following the data.
Okay, thank you. And I think this is probably one for both of you, but I'll go to you, Jacob, first. So do you think that traditional media platforms like local newspapers have devalued their own brands and the trust in them by focusing so much on what makes shareable social content? And as a result, is there potential for a bit of a full circle moment where more old school news stories become more valuable again?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely. Can you repeat it to me, please?
Sure. I think, so asking about whether local news has devalued itself by chasing, I guess, clicks, shareable social content. But do you think that there's a place for traditional local news reporting to make a comeback rather than, I guess, clickbait, socially shareable pieces?
Yeah, well, it is making a comeback. I can tell you that with the rise of people like the Mill Media Group. I'm not sure if anyone on this call has heard of them. There's 6. It started as a Substack newsletter in Manchester, and it's expanded and evolved into 6 UK cities now. And it really is a renaissance of long form journalism. It is really all about the less is more kind of model. Has the clickbait model devalued local news? Undoubtedly, yes. I think if you go to a lot of local news websites and they're talking about, I don't know, generic money saving tips or what's trending on socials, I mean, you see a lot of this kind of generic clickbaity content. You don't get the sense of the town or the city that it's reporting on. So yes, it has devalued it, but I would say a lot of people have woken up to this problem and are providing alternatives. There's a fantastic one in Ipswich called ipswich.co.uk, which is all about community positive reporting. There's examples wherever you look. So yes, on the top levels and the regional publishers, you could probably agree with that statement. But the comeback is happening, and I've seen plenty of examples of that.
Okay, great. And Sean, do you feel the same? Is local press, is that an area that you reach out to a lot for your campaigns, or has it all got a bit clickbaity?
I agree with Jacob, and the Mill Media would be the one I would pull out as well. I mean, I think they're finalists for 2 British Journalism Awards now. It's a fantastic business. What things like Mill Media show is that people are prepared to pay for quality journalism, whether that's around a particular local area, whether that's around a particular niche. That's what makes Substack so interesting. That's why you saw a couple of years ago a number of prominent national journalists, people like Graham Ruddock, left the Guardian went from the Guardian to the Times and then to Substack to set up his own media platform to become a publisher himself. I think the Mill starting in Manchester was no coincidence. Yes, it's a hotbed of journalism. Yes, it's the birthplace of the Guardian, but it's also, if you go on the Manchester Evening News website, it's a mess. It is pop-ups. This is the UK's oldest regional newspaper. It is full of pop-ups around predictions of what's going to happen on Emmerdale, stories, as Jacob said, that are nowhere near being relevant or specific to that area. So it's no wonder that people turn for quality journalism. The Manchester Evening News has a proud history of journalism. You just can't find it on their website.
If I can build on that for 2 seconds, it's very indicative of the moment that we're in. We are pivoting away from the scale era and into the loyalty area, where those sort of things will fund subscription models. Manchester Evening News has just launched a paywall. So finally, Reach PLC is kind of realizing that the future is not with the scale-based ad-based model. It is now with premium models based around royalty. And so if Reach PLC have finally got round to it, that is an indication which way the wind is turning. And I wouldn't underestimate niche outlets. I wouldn't underestimate independent news outlets like London Centric. Jim Waterson's title was formerly at The Guardian. These players are really showing that they can punch above their weight, and they are a serious force to be contended with.
Okay, thank you. And we have reached the end of our time together. So thank you both. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. As I say, we'll be sharing an overview of today's session via the Vuelio blog, and we'll also be sharing a recording of today's session with everyone who signed up. So thank you to everyone again for joining us. Have a good afternoon and happy pitching. And goodbye.
Thanks, guys.